It was a warm summer day, the kind that feels like it could last forever. The small lakeside town buzzed quietly with life, children laughing, birds chirping, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Ethan, a 10-year-old boy with an infectious grin and an endless sense of curiosity, was spending the afternoon doing what he loved most, exploring. His family had come to the lake for a picnic, and while the adults set up under the shade of an old oak tree, Ethan wandered off to the rocky shoreline, his bare feet dancing over smooth stones. Ethan wasn't like other kids. There was something about him that seemed older, wiser, even though he was just a child. He loved to look at the way sunlight danced on the water or how the breeze carried whispers through the trees. But that day, something felt different. Ethan couldn't explain it, but there was a strange pull toward the water, as if the lake itself was calling his name. "Be careful, Ethan," his mum called out, her voice tinged with concern, but also softened by a smile. Ethan turned and waved, flashing her a grin. "I'll be fine, Mom," he shouted back. But those would be the last words she'd hear from him for what felt like an eternity. As Ethan hopped from rock to rock, he reached a spot where the water shimmered with an almost unnatural glow. He crouched down to get a closer look, his small fingers brushing the surface, sending ripples across the reflection of the sky. Suddenly, his foot slipped on a mossy rock. In an instant, he was plunged into the cold, dark water. The fall was quick, but time seemed to slow as he sank beneath the surface. The shock of the icy water stole the air from his lungs. He thrashed, reaching for anything to hold onto, but the lake was deep and the shore was far away. The laughter of children and the gentle sounds of the world above became muffled, fading into an eerie silence. Back at the picnic spot, Ethan's mother glanced toward the water, expecting to see him jumping and playing as he always did. But something was wrong. She couldn't see him. Panic set in as she dropped the plate of food she was holding and ran toward the shoreline. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the idyllic calm of the day. Others quickly realized what was happening. A man nearby dove into the water, frantically searching for the boy. Minutes passed like hours. Ethan's mother was now on her knees by the edge of the lake, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Please, God, please bring him back." Finally, the man surfaced, pulling Ethan's limp body from the water. His pale face, his lifeless form, it was every parent's worst nightmare. People gathered around, shouting, calling for help, but there was no response from the boy, no breath, no pulse. The world seemed to stop. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but to Ethan's mother, it felt like a lifetime. They worked tirelessly, performing CPR, doing everything they could. "Come on, kid," one of them muttered under his breath, sweat dripping from his brow. But with each passing moment, hope began to fade. Ethan's mother clutched his small, wet hand, refusing to let go. "He's a fighter," she sobbed. "He's always been a fighter. Don't you give up on him." After what felt like an eternity, the lead paramedic glanced at the clock. 30 minutes had passed since Ethan was pulled from the water. 30 minutes without oxygen, without a heartbeat. She shook her head solemnly and whispered to the others, "We've done all we can." The words were like knives to Ethan's mother. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. "No, you can't stop. Keep trying." But the paramedics knew the truth. There was nothing more to be done. Ethan was gone. His mother collapsed, her cries echoing across the lake, a sound so full of pain and loss that it seemed to hang in the air like a shadow. As the crowd began to disperse, their faces heavy with sorrow, something happened. It was so subtle at first that no one noticed. A faint gasp, a twitch of a finger, and then Ethan's chest heaved, as he took in a deep, shuddering breath. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the onlookers. "He's alive!" someone shouted. The paramedics scrambled back to him, checking for vitals. His pulse was weak, but it was there. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around, confused and trembling. His mother held him close, sobbing uncontrollably. "You're back," she whispered over and over, kissing his forehead. "You're back." But Ethan didn't seem fully present. His gaze wasn't on his mother or the crowd around him. It was distant, as if he was looking at something or someone beyond them all. And then he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I met him," he said, his words sending chills through everyone who heard them. His mother stared at him, her heart pounding. "Met who, sweetie? What are you talking about?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but there was no fear in them. Instead, there was something else, something unshakable. "I met Jesus," he said, his voice trembling, "and he told me something I have to tell everyone." The crowd stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew. Ethan couldn't explain how he felt as he came back to consciousness. One moment, he was submerged in the cold, endless depths of the lake. And the next, he was somewhere else. He described it later as stepping through a door, a transition so seamless and effortless that it was as though he'd simply blinked, and everything had changed. The first thing he noticed was the light. It wasn't like any light he had seen before. It wasn't just bright. It was alive, warm, and all-encompassing. It surrounded him and seemed to fill him, wrapping him in a love so powerful that tears immediately welled up in his eyes. He couldn't see where the light began or ended. It was infinite. And then there was the silence. Not the heavy, eerie silence of the lake, but a peaceful, harmonious quiet, as though the universe itself was at rest. But the silence wasn't empty. Ethan heard something faint, like the distant sound of a choir singing a melody he somehow already knew, even though he had never heard it before. At first, Ethan was alone in this space, or at least he thought he was. But soon, he became aware of a presence, one that was so powerful and so overwhelming that he couldn't bring himself to look up. The presence was full of love, radiating an acceptance that seemed to penetrate every corner of his soul. And yet, there was something else, a sadness, a longing, as if this being had been waiting for Ethan for a very long time. Then he heard the voice. It wasn't loud or commanding. It was soft but resonant, reaching into the deepest parts of him. "Ethan," the voice said, calling his name as though it had been spoken 1,000,000 times before, as though the being had known him forever. Ethan dared to lift his gaze, and there he was. Jesus. Ethan didn't need to be told who he was. He just knew. His eyes were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, filled with both unimaginable love and a profound sorrow. Ethan wanted to run to him, to throw his arms around him, but he was frozen in awe. "You are so loved," Jesus said. And with those words, Ethan felt a warmth that melted every fear and doubt he'd ever carried. Tears streamed down his face. But then Jesus' expression changed. His smile softened, and the sorrow in his eyes became more pronounced. "There is something I need to show you," Jesus said. Suddenly, the light around them shifted, and Ethan found himself standing somewhere completely different. He didn't recognize the place at first. It wasn't the serene, glowing realm he had just been in. Instead, it was dark, chaotic, and filled with people. There were long lines of individuals stretching as far as the eye could see, and each person was stepping forward toward a station. Ethan couldn't see what was happening at the front of the line, but he could feel the tension in the air, the unease, the fear. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Jesus looked at him with a heavy heart. This is a glimpse of what is to come if they are not careful. Ethan squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he noticed something strange. As each person stepped forward, they received something, on their foreheads or on their hands. Ethan couldn't see what it was exactly, but it left a faint mark, a glowing imprint that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "Why are they taking it?" Ethan asked. Jesus' face grew more serious. "Because they believe they must. They think it will save them, protect them, give them what they need. But they do not see the cost." Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He wanted to shout at the people, to warn them, but his voice wouldn't come. He turned back to Jesus, panic in his eyes. "What happens to them?" he asked. Jesus sighed, and the weight of his sadness was almost unbearable. "They lose themselves," he said. "Once they take it, they are no longer free. They become bound to it, enslaved in ways they do not yet understand." Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "But can't they stop? Can't they choose something else?" Jesus placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That is why I am showing this to you. They need to know. They need to understand before it is too late. Ethan, you must tell them." The scene shifted again, and Ethan found himself back in the presence of the light, but his heart was heavy with what he had just seen. He looked up at Jesus, his voice trembling. "But how can I make them listen? I'm just a kid." Jesus knelt in front of him, meeting him at eye level. His gaze was steady, filled with both strength and compassion. "You are not alone, Ethan. I will be with you. Speak the truth, and those who are meant to hear it will listen." Ethan nodded, though he didn't fully understand. There was so much he wanted to ask, so much he didn't know. But before he could say another word, Jesus stood and spoke again. "One more thing," he said. "There is someone you will meet, someone who will play a role in this. His name is Baron Trump." The name struck Ethan like a bolt of lightning. He didn't know who this person was or why he was important, but Jesus' words were clear and deliberate. "Remember this," Jesus said, his voice calm but firm. "The truth will come through those who are willing to see it." And with that, the light around Ethan began to fade. He felt himself being pulled away, back toward the world he had left behind. "Wait!" he cried, reaching out. "I don't want to leave." But the voice came again, soothing and reassuring. "This is not the end, Ethan. It is only the beginning." And then, just like that, Ethan opened his eyes, gasping for air, as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. His mother's tear-streaked face hovered above him, her cries of joy and relief echoing in his ears. But Ethan couldn't focus on her or the crowd around him. The vision, the warning, and Jesus' words were seared into his soul. He had come back, but he wasn't the same. Ethan's return to life was nothing short of a miracle. The gasps of those around him were quickly drowned out by his mother's sobs of relief. She clung to him, her tears soaking into his damp hair as if she were afraid to let go, afraid that he might slip away again. The paramedics, stunned, quickly jumped back into action, checking his vitals and shining lights into his eyes. "How is this possible?" one of them murmured, but no one had an answer. Ethan, however, wasn't paying attention to the commotion. His body was there, trembling and weak, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. His wide eyes darted around the scene as though he was searching for something or someone that wasn't there. He kept whispering under his breath, words that were too soft to make out at first. "Who did you meet, sweetheart?" his mother asked, stroking his face, her own tears blurring her vision. "What are you trying to say?" Ethan turned his gaze toward her, his eyes filled with a depth that seemed far beyond his years. "I met him," he whispered hoarsely. "I met Jesus." The words sent chills through everyone who heard them. Some of the bystanders crossed themselves, others murmured prayers under their breath. His mother froze, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. "Ethan," she said softly, you saw Jesus?" Ethan nodded, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "He told me things I have to tell everyone, but it's so big, Mom, I don't know how to do it." She hugged him tightly, her own heart torn between the joy of his miraculous return and the unsettling weight of his words. She didn't know what to make of it. How could anyone? But she knew one thing. Her son was alive, and that was enough for now. As the ambulance rushed Ethan to the hospital for further evaluation, he remained quiet, staring out the window at the passing scenery. But in his mind, he was replaying everything he had seen. The light, the love, the warnings. It was all so vivid, so real, and yet it felt impossible to put into words. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he convince people to listen? The doctors at the hospital ran test after test, marveling at the fact that Ethan was alive. By all medical accounts, he shouldn't have been. 30 minutes without a heartbeat was well beyond the point of recovery. Yet here he was, awake, alert, and speaking with a clarity that was almost unsettling. But Ethan's mind wasn't on the doctors or their questions. As they poked and prodded, he kept thinking about the vision, the mark, and the strange name Jesus had mentioned. Baron Trump. It echoed in his mind like a bell, growing louder with every passing moment. Who was Baron Trump? Why was he important? And why had Jesus entrusted Ethan with this knowledge? Ethan's parents decided to take him home the next day, despite the doctor's protests that he should stay for observation. He wasn't sick, they argued. He was fine. Better than fine, even. But Ethan's mother knew there was something deeper going on, something that couldn't be explained by medical charts or machines. At home, Ethan's demeanor began to change. He was no longer the carefree boy who spent his days exploring and playing. He was quiet, introspective, as if carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders. At night, he would sit by the window, staring at the stars, whispering prayers that his parents couldn't quite hear. "Please help me," he would say softly. "Show me how to do this." And then, one morning, he came downstairs with a determination in his eyes that startled his parents. "I need to talk to people," he said. "I need to tell them what I saw." His parents exchanged nervous glances. "Ethan," his father said gently, "maybe we should wait a little longer. You've been through a lot." But Ethan shook his head. "There isn't time," he said, his voice firm. "People need to know. If they don't, something terrible is going to happen." Reluctantly, his parents agreed to let him speak at their local church. The pastor, a kind man who had known Ethan since he was a baby, was hesitant at first, but couldn't ignore the urgency in the boy's eyes. "Let him speak," the pastor finally said. "If God has given him a message, who are we to stand in the way?" That Sunday, the church was packed. Word had spread quickly about Ethan's miraculous recovery and his claim to have seen Jesus. People were curious, skeptical, hopeful. As Ethan stood at the front of the congregation, his small frame dwarfed by the pulpit, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I was gone," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of his words. "I was gone for 30 minutes, but I wasn't just asleep. I was somewhere else. I was with Jesus." The room fell silent. Ethan's eyes scanned the crowd, meeting each gaze with a seriousness that sent chills down their spines. "He showed me things," he continued. "Things that are going to happen if we're not careful. There's something coming. Something that's going to look good, but it's not. It's dangerous." He hesitated, his voice catching in his throat as he thought about the mark, the lines of people, the glowing imprint. "It's going to make people think they're safe, like it's helping them, but it's a trap, and once they take it, they can't go back." Murmurs rippled through the congregation, a mix of awe and unease. Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to keep going. "Jesus said I have to tell people. He said it's my job to warn them. But it's not just my job, it's all of ours. We have to stay close to him. We have to trust him, not the things that seem easy." By the time Ethan finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People came up to him afterward, some with tears streaming down their faces, others shaking their heads in disbelief. But one thing was clear: his words had struck a chord. Whether they believed him or not, they couldn't ignore the conviction in his voice. As the weeks passed, Ethan's story spread far beyond the walls of that small church. People from neighboring towns began to visit, wanting to hear the boy who had seen Jesus. Reporters came, though his parents kept them at a distance. But despite the growing attention, Ethan remained focused on his mission. He didn't care about fame or recognition. He only cared about the warning. And yet, there was still the question of Baron Trump. The name haunted him, its significance just out of reach. He didn't know who Baron was or how he fit into the vision, but deep down, he knew the answer would come. In time. As the years passed, Ethan's story continued to ripple through communities, carried by whispers, news articles, and personal testimonies. People who had heard him speak said they couldn't forget his words about the light, about Jesus, about the warning. For many, it was a call to return to faith, to reevaluate their lives, and to prepare for something they couldn't fully understand. But not everyone believed him. There were skeptics, critics, and even a few who openly mocked him, calling him a child with an overactive imagination. Some dismissed his vision as a product of oxygen deprivation or trauma. Others accused his family of using him for attention. Yet Ethan never let the doubts shake him. He remembered what Jesus had told him: "Speak the truth, and those who are meant to hear it will listen." And many did listen. Ethan began to notice changes in people, subtle but profound. Families reconciled. Communities grew stronger. People who had been distant from their faith began attending church again, clinging to the hope and love Ethan described. It wasn't just the warning that stuck with them. It was the way Ethan spoke about Jesus' love, about the light that could guide them even in the darkest times. But as much as Ethan saw the good, he also saw the shadows. The world around him seemed to grow more divided, more chaotic. Technology advanced at a dizzying pace, and with it came promises of convenience and safety. Promises that sounded eerily familiar to what he had seen in his vision. People lined up for the latest innovations, microchips embedded in their hands to unlock doors, new identification systems that promised to simplify life. Ethan watched these developments with unease, feeling the weight of the warning he had carried since that day at the lake. And still, the name lingered in his mind: Baron Trump. Ethan didn't know why it mattered, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the name was a key to something larger, something he hadn't yet grasped. Years later, Ethan, now a teenager, was invited to speak at a national faith conference. By this point, his story was well known, and the invitation came as no surprise. But this event was different. It was larger than any crowd he'd ever spoken to before, with thousands in attendance and millions more watching online. As Ethan stood backstage, preparing to take the stage, he felt a strange unease settle over him. He had spoken about his experience countless times, but something about this moment felt heavier, as if the stakes were higher than ever. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, asking for guidance. When his name was called, the audience erupted into applause. Ethan stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding at first, and took a deep breath. He began, as he always did, recounting the day he drowned, the light, and the message Jesus had given him. But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. A figure walked onto the stage, standing just behind the curtains, watching him. At first, Ethan didn't notice. He was too focused on his message, on the faces in the crowd. But then, as he glanced to the side, his breath caught in his throat. It was him, Barron Trump. Barron, now a young man, stepped forward, his expression calm but curious. The audience murmured in surprise, many recognizing him instantly. Ethan froze, his heart racing. It wasn't just the shock of seeing Barron in person, it was the unmistakable sense that this moment had been orchestrated, that it was part of the plan Jesus had set into motion years ago. Barron approached the podium, and for a moment, the two young men simply stared at each other. Ethan saw something in Barron's eyes, a flicker of understanding, as though he already knew why he was there. The moment felt charged, electric, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then Barron spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it, as though he too carried a burden few could comprehend. "I've been dreaming about this," he said, his words sending a ripple of astonishment through the crowd. "I've seen you before, Ethan, in my dreams." Ethan's heart pounded. You've seen me?" Barron nodded. "For years. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I would meet you one day. And now, here we are." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief, as if a piece of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. He didn't know what Barron's role was, or why Jesus had mentioned his name, but he knew this moment mattered. It was part of the plan, even if he couldn't yet see the full picture. Barron turned to the crowd, his expression solemn. "I don't know why I've been called here," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I believe Ethan's story. I believe in his warning. And I believe we're all here for a reason, to stand together, to stay strong in our faith, and to prepare for what's coming." The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan barely heard it. He was lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Barron's presence, his dreams, his words, it all felt like a confirmation of what Ethan had known all along. This wasn't just his story. It was a story for everyone. As the conference ended and the audience slowly dispersed, Ethan and Barron sat together backstage, talking late into the night. They shared their experiences, their fears, their hopes. And though many questions remained unanswered, one thing was clear: their meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was a moment of divine purpose, a reminder that the journey they were on was far from over. For Ethan, the vision of the light, the warning about the mark, and Jesus' message of love continued to guide him. And now, with Barron by his side, he felt more certain than ever that he wasn't alone in his mission. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, trusting in the one who had brought them this far. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.